When I first bought the piece of land on the edge of town, it was everything I had ever wanted: a quiet stretch of countryside where the only sounds were the wind in the trees, the calls of distant birds, and the occasional hum of a tractor from a neighboring farm. For years, I had been saving to escape the noise of the suburbs, and finally, I had a place where I could breathe, build my home, and live without constant interference. The property wasn't massive compared to the sprawling ranches further west, but it was mine. A few acres with a long gravel driveway, some wooded areas, a pond, and plenty of open space where I could one day expand. The very first improvement I made was installing a strong steel gate at the front entrance, partly for security and partly because I liked the sense of privacy it gave. I had seen too many cases of trespassers or bored teenagers wandering into properties they didn't own, and I wanted a clear boundary that this was private land. At first, everything was perfect. Neighbors waved as they passed. I got to know the folks who owned the farms nearby, and I spent weekends working on small projects around the house. But that peace was shattered when the local HOA, an association I had never agreed to join and which had no jurisdiction over my property, decided that my gate was somehow a violation. Out of the blue, I received a letter claiming that the gate restricted access to a public path and that I was to remove it immediately or face penalties and further action. I was stunned. I had done my homework before buying the property, checking county maps, surveying the land, and confirming all legal boundaries. There was no public path, no easement, no shared right-of-way, nothing. My driveway was exactly that. Mine. I drove down to the HOA office to clear up what I assumed was a clerical mistake. Instead, I was greeted with cold stares and smug responses from a group of board members who acted like they owned the entire town. One woman, who seemed to be their ringleader, told me flatly, "Your property sits on what we consider a community path. People have been walking through there for years, and the gate is an obstruction." I explained calmly at first that their so-called community path was a private driveway on my deeded land, and that the only reason people may have been walking there before was because the previous owner didn't care to stop them. But that didn't make it public. She smirked and said, "That's not how this works. This neighborhood has always used that path, and you don't get to just close it off because you feel like it." At that point, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a power play. They were testing me, assuming I would cave in like so many others who had been bullied by HOAs. I refused. I went home, gathered my paperwork, and sent them a registered letter with copies of the deed, county property maps, and confirmation from the assessor's office that the land was mine and mine alone. I told them, politely but firmly, that they had no authority to demand the removal of my gate, and that any further harassment would be considered trespassing and intimidation. Weeks passed, and instead of backing off, the HOA escalated. Members began showing up at the edge of my property, taking pictures of the gate, muttering about fines, and even attempting to walk around it like they owned the place. One afternoon, I caught a couple trying to push the gate open, and when I confronted them, they insisted they had every right to use the path. When I asked who told them that, they said the HOA board had assured the neighborhood that my gate would soon be gone. That was the last straw. I wasn't just dealing with bureaucratic nonsense anymore. This was outright harassment and defamation. So, I decided if they wanted to make this a battle, I would end it once and for all, but not in the way they expected. Instead of waiting for them to wear me down, I went bigger. I made an offer to the farmer who owned the adjacent strip of land that the HOA actually did use as a walking trail. It wasn't part of my original property, but when I looked into it, I realized it was for sale. Within weeks, I closed the deal. Suddenly, I didn't just own my house and driveway. I owned the very stretch of land the HOA claimed was their community path. The irony was delicious. The next morning, I put up fencing and extended my gate to cover the new section. Then I installed clear, legally backed, no trespassing, private property signs along every edge. The so-called public path was closed forever. And this time, I had not only my deed, but also a brand new purchase to back it up. When the HOA board found out, they exploded. Angry letters poured in, accusing me of being hostile to the community and violating neighborhood traditions. Some even threatened to sue, but When I reminded them that they had zero legal standing and that any trespassing would be met with legal action of my own, the threats fizzled. What they didn't know was that I had also spoken directly to the county sheriff's department, showing them the deeds and maps. I made it clear that I was not only protecting my property, but also tired of the harassment. The sheriff, seeing that everything I had was airtight, assured me that if anyone tried to force their way past the gate, they'd be the ones in trouble. For the first time in months, I felt real relief. Not only had I defended my property, but I had outsmarted the HOA at their own game. They had tried to bully me into submission, but instead, I doubled down and removed any shred of their supposed access. The gate stayed, the land was mine, and the so-called public path ceased to exist. To this day, I still see them drive by slowly, glaring at the fence as though sheer willpower could make it disappear. But the truth is simple. You don't get to rewrite property lines just because you want a shortcut, and you don't get to bully people into surrendering what they rightfully own. If anything, the whole ordeal taught me that when someone pushes against your rights, sometimes the best solution isn't to compromise, it's to strengthen your position so thoroughly that they never dare try again. After the purchase of the adjoining strip of land and the installation of extended fencing, I thought maybe, just maybe, the HOA would finally realize that I wasn't someone they could push around. But as I quickly learned, people who thrive on control rarely back down quietly. Instead of admitting defeat, they doubled down with a campaign of passive-aggressive tactics designed to wear me out. It started with little things, anonymous notes stuffed in my mailbox telling me I was ruining the spirit of the neighborhood, or strange cars slowing to a crawl outside my driveway late at night before speeding off again. Then one weekend, I woke up to find a group of joggers gathered at the edge of my property line, loudly complaining about how unfair it was that their traditional route had been blocked. One woman, who I later discovered was the daughter of the HOA president, screamed at me from across the fence that I was selfish and that everyone hates you here. I could have shouted back, but instead, I simply held up a copy of my deed, laminated and ready for moments exactly like this, and waved it like a flag. They stormed off, furious that I wouldn't play into their drama. That same week, the HOA board mailed out what they called a community notice to all households in the area. I managed to get a copy thanks to a friendly neighbor who didn't drink their Kool-Aid, and when I read it, my blood boiled. The letter accused me of illegally seizing community property, of denying public access to shared amenities, and even of endangering the safety of neighborhood children. They painted me as some kind of villain who had moved in only to destroy everything wholesome about their little bubble of control. What made it laughable was that not a single word of it was true. The land was legally mine, the so-called path was never public, and there was no easement granting them access. But the HOA counted on fear and gossip, not facts, to sway people. Sure enough, the following days were filled with dirty looks from folks who used to wave at me, muttered insults when I passed by, and even a couple of social media posts where people called me the gate tyrant. It would have been easier to give in just to make the harassment stop, but I refused to bend. Instead, I went on the offensive, not with anger, but with facts. I filed a formal complaint with the county against the HOA for defamation and harassment, attaching the false claims from their letter as evidence. I also sent a cease and desist notice to the board through my attorney, warning them that if they continued spreading lies, I would pursue legal damages. Predictably, this sent them into another frenzy. They held an emergency meeting, which my same helpful neighbor secretly recorded and later shared with me. In the recording, the board members fumed about how I was disrupting community harmony, one man suggesting they should find a way to get the county on our side, and the president even muttering that people like him don't belong here. That phrase stuck with me, not because it hurt, but because it revealed their real motive. It wasn't about a path or a gate, it was about control and exclusion. They wanted to dictate how everyone lived, and my refusal to comply was a direct threat to their power. Realizing this, I decided to strengthen my position even more. I didn't just own the gate and the fence. I wanted ironclad protection. So I invested in security cameras, not only on my property, but also along the fence line of the newly acquired strip. Every angle was covered, and the feeds uploaded directly to a cloud system in case anyone tried to vandalize or tamper with them. I posted small but clear signs saying, "Property under surveillance and trespassers will be prosecuted." Predictably, the HOA claimed this was intimidation, but the sheriff's deputy I spoke to chuckled and told me I was well within my rights. That was the best part. Every time they thought they had me cornered, I had already taken steps to ensure I was one step ahead. Things escalated further when the HOA decided to play dirty. They started filing petty complaints against me with the county, everything from improper fencing height to unauthorized construction. Each time, an inspector came out, and each time they left shaking their heads after confirming everything I'd done was perfectly legal. I even started offering them coffee while they walked the property, and one inspector joked, "Looks like they're wasting our time more than yours." The HOA's frustration grew, and their tactics became even more desperate. At one point, a group of board members tried to stage a peaceful protest at the edge of my driveway, holding signs demanding that I restore access to the community path. But when I called the sheriff and showed the deputy the deeds, the protest dissolved in less than 20 minutes, with the board members grumbling as they shuffled away. To the outside observer, it may have looked like a petty feud over a strip of land, but to me, it was about something much bigger. It was about proving that you don't get to trample over people's rights just because you sit on a committee and print official-looking letters. The HOA had built their power on intimidation and the assumption that most people wouldn't fight back. But I wasn't most people. If anything, the more they pushed, the more determined I became. And then came the turning point. One evening, while reviewing footage from my security cameras, I caught two HOA board members sneaking along the fence line with flashlights. They weren't just walking, they were measuring and taking notes. The next day, I confronted them with still shots from the footage and asked what exactly they thought they were doing trespassing on private land. Their excuse was laughable. They claimed they were surveying the community path for a future project. When I told them point blank they were trespassing and that I had video evidence to prove it, their faces went pale. I forwarded the footage to the sheriff's department and to my attorney. That move shifted the balance completely. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't the one filing complaints. I was, and unlike their baseless accusations, mine came with hard evidence of trespassing and harassment. My lawyer began drafting a lawsuit for damages, and the word must have gotten back to the board quickly, because the next week their aggressive tactics suddenly dried up. No more letters, no more protests, no more joggers yelling insults outside my gate. It was almost eerie how quickly the storm quieted, but I knew better than to assume they had given up completely. People like that rarely surrender gracefully. What mattered, though, was that I had stood my ground and proven that their bullying had limits. Every time I drove past that gate and saw it standing strong, every time I looked out at the land I now owned outright, I felt a surge of pride. They had tried to make me tear it down, but instead I had expanded, fortified, and secured it forever. And deep down, I could tell this was only the middle of the battle. If the HOA was smart, they'd leave me alone from here on out. But if they weren't, well, I was more than ready to keep fighting because now I knew exactly how to win. By the time a few weeks passed without so much as a peep from the HOA, I should have felt victorious, but a part of me remained cautious because silence in their case never meant peace. It meant they were regrouping, scheming, and looking for another angle of attack. My instincts proved right when one morning I found a bright orange notice taped to my gate claiming that the County Planning Commission had deemed my fencing and gate non-compliant with community access ordinances and that I had 15 days to remove them or face fines. At first glance, it looked official until I noticed the formatting was off, the seal was blurry, and the contact number listed wasn't a county office at all, but the HOA's office number. I actually laughed out loud holding the paper, marveling at how desperate they had become, resorting to counterfeiting government documents to scare me. I drove straight to the actual county planning office, slammed the fake notice on the desk, and the staff there were appalled. Within hours, I had a signed statement from the county confirming that my property was compliant, that the document was a forgery, and that if the HOA had indeed created and distributed it, they could face criminal charges. I scanned copies, posted them on a community bulletin board, and even attached them to a mass email I sent to every homeowner in the neighborhood. My email was simple: this is the truth. They lied to you. The path they claim is public is not public. Here is the county statement. Decide for yourself who you should trust. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Neighbors who had been glaring at me for weeks suddenly began to turn their anger toward the HOA board, demanding explanations for why they had been deceived. A few even came to my driveway to apologize, admitting they had believed the board's lies but now realized the truth. I wasn't looking for apologies, but their change in attitude proved that sunlight really is the best disinfectant. When bullies are exposed, their power crumbles. Of course, the HOA board didn't take kindly to being called out so publicly. They sent me a furious letter accusing me of slandering their organization and threatening to pursue legal action for defamation of character. My lawyer nearly fell out of his chair laughing when I showed it to him. He drafted a scathing response reminding them that truth is not defamation, that the forgery incident could itself constitute fraud, and that if they wanted to dance in court, we'd be happy to bring everything into the open record. Strangely enough, after that letter, their threats stopped, but their pettiness did not. Suddenly, I started noticing odd things around my property: trash tossed over the fence, nails scattered near the driveway, and even my mailbox vandalized with spray paint spelling out "Path Thief." It was clear some of their more rabid supporters were resorting to childish retaliation. Instead of letting it rattle me, I doubled down on security, brighter motion-activated floodlights, an upgraded camera system, and even a couple of discreet trail cameras hidden in the trees along the fence line. Within a week, my cameras caught a clear shot of two teenagers tossing garbage over the fence, one of whom, I later learned, was the grandson of the HOA president. When I sent that footage to the sheriff's office, the deputy paid the boys' parents a visit, and the vandalism stopped immediately. The HOA's grip was slipping not only because of my legal defenses, but also because their own actions were alienating the very neighbors they claimed to represent. It wasn't long before whispers started reaching me that some homeowners were planning a petition to recall the current board members, tired of the drama and potential liability being stirred up. That gave me an idea. Rather than sitting back and waiting, I quietly reached out to those neighbors and offered to provide documentation of every false claim, forged notice, and harassment incident I had endured. My intention wasn't to run for the board myself. I wanted nothing to do with their politics, but I knew that arming the community with truth would accelerate the downfall of the HOA's corrupt leadership. Meanwhile, I took another bold step to secure my property. I applied for a formal resurvey of all boundary lines and easements by a licensed county surveyor. When the results came back, they didn't just confirm my ownership, they highlighted the fact that the so-called community path the HOA kept whining about had never existed on any legal map, not even decades earlier. The surveyor's official report, stamped and signed, was a weapon stronger than any fence, and I made sure copies were delivered to both the county office and the HOA itself. When the board president confronted me in person one afternoon, waving the survey report like it was a piece of trash, she shouted, "You can't just erase history." I calmly replied, "This isn't history. It's property law, and you've been lying to everyone." The look on her face, red with fury but powerless to argue, was something I'll never forget. She stormed off, and within days the petition to remove her and several other board members was in full swing. As much satisfaction as that brought me, I still kept my focus on protecting what mattered: my land, my rights, and my peace. I began planting a thick line of trees and shrubs along the fence, creating not just a barrier, but a living wall of privacy. It would take years for them to grow fully, but already the sight of green replacing bare fencing felt symbolic. Like I was reclaiming not just the space, but the sense of tranquility I had originally moved here for. With Every shovel of dirt, I thought about how the HOA had tried to strip me of peace, only to make me dig in deeper and grow stronger. By the end of that season, my property didn't just feel like land with a gate. It felt like a fortress, a statement, and a sanctuary where their reach could not penetrate. And still, I knew this was not the final chapter, because people like them never admit defeat. They lick their wounds, plot in the shadows, and wait for another chance. But so long as I stood prepared, with deeds, laws, evidence, and determination, they would never win. As winter approached and the leaves fell, the once vibrant hostility from the HOA seemed to dwindle into a simmering resentment. Yet, I never let my guard down, because I knew that beneath the silence, grudges were festering, and people like the ones I had been battling rarely walked away without attempting one final strike. My prediction proved true when, just after the holidays, I received notice that the HOA had officially filed a civil complaint in county court, accusing me of unlawfully restricting community access, harassment of board members, and even destroying shared amenities. At first glance, it looked intimidating, pages of legal jargon stamped with court headers, but as I flipped through, I realized it was the same baseless nonsense they had been spewing for months, dressed up to look more official. The irony, of course, was that their very complaint opened the door for me to countersue and finally put everything on record. My attorney and I filed a countersuit not only for harassment and trespassing, but also for defamation, fraud, over the forged notice, and emotional distress caused by their campaign of intimidation. When the first hearing came around, I walked into that courtroom armed with a mountain of evidence, video footage of trespassers, copies of every threatening letter, the county survey report, signed statements from the Planning Commission disproving their claims, and even recordings of their own meetings thanks to my neighbor's leak. The HOA board, on the other hand, shuffled in with binders of hearsay, angry testimonials, and no concrete proof of any wrongdoing on my part. From the very first exchange, it was clear the judge was unimpressed with their theatrics. He asked them point blank to identify the supposed public path on official maps, and when they couldn't, he raised an eyebrow and turned to me. I slid the survey report across the table, along with county assessor records, showing my ownership was indisputable. The judge took one long look at the stack of evidence, then turned back to the HOA president, whose face was turning an unhealthy shade of red. "So, what you're telling me," he said dryly, "is that you've dragged this man into court over a path that doesn't legally exist?" The silence that followed was deafening. That moment was the crack in their armor, and I knew the battle was about to swing decisively in my favor. Over the course of the trial, every lie they had spun unraveled, every accusation fell flat, and every attempt to paint me as the villain backfired. Witnesses they had convinced to testify on their behalf stumbled under cross-examination, admitting they had only repeated what the board told them and had no personal knowledge of the land's legal status. On the other hand, my evidence was airtight, meticulously organized, and impossible to refute. After days of testimony, the judge issued a ruling that not only dismissed their complaint in full, but also granted my countersuit in part, awarding damages for harassment and ordering the HOA to cover my legal fees. The judgment was a financial blow to them, but more importantly, it was a public declaration that they had been wrong all along. Word spread quickly throughout the community, and suddenly the whispers were no longer about me being a path thief, but about how the HOA had wasted everyone's time and money chasing a fantasy. Homeowners who had once blindly supported the board now openly called for resignations, and within months, most of the old guard, including the furious president who had spearheaded the war against me, either resigned in disgrace or were voted out entirely. Their replacements, perhaps wiser or simply more cautious, reached out to me with olive branches, assuring me they had no intention of meddling in my affairs and wanted to restore harmony to the neighborhood. I accepted their words politely, but made it clear that my property was off limits to any future community claims. I didn't forget what had happened, and I didn't forgive the months of harassment easily, but I did relish the quiet that followed. For the first time since moving in, I could step outside without glaring eyes on me, without anonymous notes, without protesters at the edge of my driveway. The gate stood tall, the fence strong, and the land mine completely and legally. I poured myself into improving the property further, planting more trees, restoring the pond, and even building a small workshop where I could tinker on projects in peace. Friends and family who visited often joked that I lived in a fortress, but to me, it wasn't about walls, it was about freedom. Every post of the fence, every section of the gate, was a reminder that I had fought for my right to live undisturbed, and I had won. The HOA, once a looming shadow over my daily life, had been reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors, a reminder of what happens when power-hungry people overstep and get caught. Even years later, when I drove past the community bulletin board and saw cheerful notices about bake sales or neighborhood cleanups, I sometimes thought back to the day I first received that ridiculous letter demanding I tear down my gate. What they didn't realize then was that their arrogance had awakened something in me, a determination not just to defend myself, but to stand up for the principle that property rights are not negotiable, no matter how many board members gather in a room and decide otherwise. In the end, the gate they tried to destroy became a symbol of something larger, a stand against bullying, against dishonesty, and against the illusion of power. And as I looked out one evening at the sunset casting golden light across the fence line, the trees I had planted growing tall and strong, and the path that once stirred so much conflict, now reclaimed forever by nature, I felt nothing but peace. The land was mine, the battle was over, and the gate would stand long after the HOA's schemes had been forgotten, a quiet but unshakable testament to the fact that sometimes the only way to win against tyranny is not to bow, not to bend, but to hold the line and make sure it never opens again.